Hey, everybody. Welcome in a Little Bit of Life podcast right here with your host, Little. We have a very exciting guest on with us today and just an exceptional topic, especially on the podcast. The motto is what we seem to think but don't say. We have on Amos with us today. He's a professor of law at the University of Utah, and he specializes in institution complicity, enabling culture, and sexual assault. He's also the author of the book that you can now pre-order, and it is available for ordering at the end of this month. And it's all about the title, The Complicity of Silence, Confronting Ecosystems of Child Sexual Assault in Schools. Amos, it's really good to see you, and I'm glad to
Thank
have
you
you
so
on.
much for having me. After we solved the technology.
Absolutely. We're diving right in, especially being a professor of law, you found this story, you dove in, you got attached, and you have done some just incredible things. So bring us to November 1997 for the topic we're here to talk about today.
So I gave a talk a couple of years ago, and sometimes, these things happen. You get an email after the talk, Amos, I heard your talk, blah, blah, blah. And I got this email from someone who says, you have no idea who I am, but I heard, it was by Zoom, and I heard you speak yesterday, last week, whenever it was. And I'm a victim of abuse by my teacher. I am today in my, I think, 30s or 40s. I thought we were in love. I realized later we weren't in love. I was, he wasn't. And if you have time, I'd love to chat with you. So as is my wont when I get emails like that, which I get most mornings, I immediately, we set up a time to chat. And she said, I've got to put you in touch with a woman named Terry Miller, who runs an organization called Sesame. I said, sure, that's great. And we had a call with Ms. Miller from Sesame. And somewhere along our call, she says, you've got to talk to Dan Barber. I said, who's Mr. Barber? She said, well, he broke Jeremy Bell. I'm like, who's Mr. Bell? And she said, how stupid are you? I said, okay, well, then she told me about that Jeremy was a 12-year-old boy in West Virginia in 1997 who had been killed by his teacher that had been subsequently, immediately covered up by local law enforcement. So I said, well, let's talk to Mr. Barber. And we got Mr. Barber. He has you know what a flip phone? You're too young. You don't even know what a flip phone is. Mr. Barber has a flip phone. And we called Mr. Barber, and who said to me, he can't pronounce it. It took him a while to pronounce Guiora. So he called me Dr. G. He said, Dr. G, I don't do email. I don't do Zoom. I don't do Skype. You want to meet with me? You get in a jet plane and you come to Erie, Pennsylvania. You hear something like that and right? So I flew from Salt Lake to Cleveland, Ohio, and then I drove to his home in Erie. I got to his home in Erie. By now we laugh about this. I'm ringing his doorbell and he's not answering. I thought to myself, all right, so I got set up. It's kind of cool. You fly out to Erie, Pennsylvania. There's a story there. And finally, Mr. Barber opened the door and he let me into his absolutely beautiful home. The home has been written about. It's absolutely beautiful. And then for the next 4 hours, I sat on this beautiful table, absolutely beautiful table. And Mr. Barber spoke. He stood and spoke. But when we had talked by phone the first time, he said, if you come out to Erie, waiting for you on the desk will be a typewriter, a pencil, and an eraser. You, Tabitha, wouldn't know a typewriter, you wouldn't know a pencil, and you wouldn't know an eraser. And I got to that table, and there was no typewriter. There was a yellow tablet, and there was a pencil, but there were two other things. There was a picture of Jeremy Bell, and there were boxes, Bell, waiting for me at the end of the table. After the 4 hours, I said to Mr. Barber, I said, let's go eat. And we went to eat, a place that's become our favorite place in Erie. And at the end of the day, I said to Mr. Barber, I said, I don't know what the hell we're going to do with all this, but there's something here. Because in his study, there were 15,000 pages of documents. And I came back the next day and we agreed that there is a project here that we kind of think about. Because as a law professor, what I know to do is to write articles, books, whatever. And I talked with some people and I went back to Erie and I went back to Erie and I went back to Erie. And finally I said, this is a book. And it's become two things. One is an article, which will be released shortly. And then indeed the book. But, and this was the great moment, which is beyond humbling. Mr. Barber made the decision to contractually bequeath to me the 15,000 pages of documents, all about the Bell case. And I don't know how many times I've been to Erie. I literally don't know how many hours he and I, Mr. Barber and I, have spent together. I think from his perspective, I think the reason that he, if you will, chose to work with me is because I'm locked in on the enabler. I don't care about the perpetrator or the pedophile. They don't interest me in the least. I mean, they're just awful, but they don't interest me. And what we've done within with the article and now what I've done with the book is reversed engineered. And it's clear to me that that little boy, when Edgar Friedrichs, the teacher, murdered him on the night of the 7th, 8th of November 1997, that little boy never should have ever been near 100 miles, 500 miles of that teacher. Because when you reverse engineer it and you realize that he'd been a pedophile for 20, 30 years, and every time there were complaints, and there were complaints, school administrators did the usual. They just, fobbed it off. And it's all documented because for all the obvious reasons, I'm super, super, super careful because the only way I know to do these projects for them to have the desired impact is I call people out by name. And it's all documented. There are timelines and graphs and charts. And it's a quote unquote, a ton of work because for me, what's at the end of the day important. I don't like the word. And if you have a better word, I'll defer to you. The book is not about Jeremy. I am quote unquote using, I hate the word, but using the Jeremy Bell murder to tell a much broader story about the ecosystem of abuse. So in the case of, in Jeremy's case, there was another boy in the cabin. He killed him in a cabin next to a river in West Virginia. There's another 12-year-old boy there, and he sends that 12-year-old boy out in the woods in West Virginia to find a payphone. And it takes a little boy a while. It's the middle of the night, right? I don't say this disrespectful. It's the backwoods of West Virginia. You ain't finding a payphone readily available to you. It's a 12-year-old boy who knows that something horrible has just happened to his friend. He makes the call. Law enforcement comes. And when they come there, the Friedrichs tells him, I've been doing CPR for 7 hours. Okay, so your facial reaction is perfect. So I've checked with physicians and they're like, no, dude, you weren't doing CPR for 7 hours. And the police find the medication that he had thrown out in the river. There are all kinds of signs that something was utterly and totally. The district attorney comes to the cabin and he makes a critical decision, which is he brings in out of retirement, literally the next day, a retired medical examiner. There is the great state of West Virginia has active medical examiners. We don't need to bring in some guy off the bench when we have, we've got a team. And the retired medical examiner, even though there were abrasions on the boy from the CPR, wink, wink, right? Writes that this was like a tragic death. The boy had a weak heart, whatever. Jeremy Bell was a really cute little 12-year-old boy who didn't have a weak heart. And he's buried. That's it. End of story. The parents are divorced, and the father, this doesn't sit well with Jeremy's father. And Mr. Bell reaches out to a cousin who has a cousin who has a cousin who lives in Erie, Pennsylvania. And she calls Mr. Barber, or writes Mr. Barber. And Mr. Barber asks to see a copy of a newspaper article because there had been a newspaper article. And within 2 seconds after reading the article, Mr. Barber says, this was murder. He then in essence, moves to West Virginia for the next 2 or 3 years and works on the case by himself initially. Then he has a team step by step by step by step. And at the end of the day, Friedrichs is indeed convicted. He will spend the rest of his life in jail, which is fine, but it's not the important issue. So what is important for our purposes, if not for Dan Barber, Edgar Friedrichs would have continued abusing little boys until forever. How do we know this? Because the weekend after, so this happens on Thursday, I think on Saturday or Sunday, Friedrich stages a suicide attempt to garner sympathy and what does the school district do with this man who a 12-year-old boy had just died in his cabin under clearly suspicious circumstances? They give him a leave of absence, calm down, And then they transfer him to a new school where he begins teaching the following fall. I mean, that's exactly the way the system. The other little boy was never really questioned by the police. He files a lawsuit, and his lawsuit's important for our purposes. The first school where Friedrich said that we know that he had abused the boys was in Philadelphia. And there was going to be a trial which never comes to fruition. And I don't want to use the word agreement because I'm not exactly sure what would be the right word, and I'm careful in the book, but the principal doesn't fire him. He allows him to retire in his 20s from the school where he was teaching. My research assistant, we went through the 15,000 pages of document. We found a handwritten letter of recommendation by the principal who knew that he had abused boys, wishing him the best of luck moving forward. Friedrich retires from teaching for a year, opens up a clothing store, a boys clothing store located next to a grade school. And then after a year moves to West Virginia and comes with this letter of recommendation, handwritten, warm, from the principal in the Philadelphia area, and then comes to West Virginia and stays in the same school district. But I mean, the abuse begins right away. And every time that, the seat gets hot, he simply moved by school administrators to another school within that district. One of the parents who complains was a police officer, because his kid had told him. And even a police officer was, whatever word you want, dismissed, fobbed, whichever word you want, by the school administrators because, a great guy. And most people having now gone through the doc, Friedrich had three things going in his favor. One, he evidently really was a good teacher. That's fine. Two, not to make this awkward, he was this good-looking guy, charming. He had means. We know he had means because he was able to also disperse gifts and money to some of the parents that were at issue. And at the end of the day, while performing a sex act on this little boy, he killed him. For me, having now worked on this, for 3 or 4 years, to say it consumed me would probably be an understatement. I had in my office the 15,000 pages, and Mr. Barber was very organized. And front and center in my office, indeed, is a picture of the boy, because I think it's important that boy's story, first of all, it's beyond tragic. But what worries me, and I think Mr. Barber as well, that the Edgar Friedrichs of the world who are out there know that the enablers will protect them. And we spent hours discussing motivation. I think if Mr. Barber were here sitting next to me, he would tell you that he thinks that the enablers also have skin in the game, that perhaps they're part of a ring, protect my back, protect your back, scratch your back, scratch my back. But, and I told Dan, and I put it in the book, because I gave room in the book for Dan's voice to be heard on the question of motivation, because I think that's an essential. But I told Mr. Barber, and it's also in the book, if I can't prove it, I can't write it. I'm writing nonfiction, not fiction. And therefore, I give room to that argument, but I can't prove it. And so, clearly, one of the important questions, which you and I could spend hours talking about, which is a crucial question, is what motivates the enablers? The PEDs frankly, they're not interesting. But we actually spent literally no time discussing the Edgar Friedrichs of the world. Dan would tell you that they're not, quote unquote, curable. I'm not an expert on pedophilia, not my area whatsoever. But if you're the school administrator and parents are coming to you and saying, Mr. Administrator, Johnny, Jimmy, and Jane and Joey are all telling us that there is something wrong here. And so what they did was let's say this were his office. They put up a glass window so people could see into his office. So what he did is just covered up the glass window. Nobody said dude, wait, we put a glass window so you could look in. Then he covers it up. Nobody's doing 1 + 1. It's generally 2. The system was clearly intended to protect him. And that's not him indirectly, directly the good name of the school. No school district wants banner headline, pedophile teacher. Nobody wants that. And so the easy thing to do is just to dismiss the complainants, the children. It is a devastating story. And so for me, the most important thing, we all have different interests when we undertake projects like this. For me, it's to work with legislators around not only the United States, but around the world. Take me, here I am in home in Israel, to criminalize the enabler in the way that I've been working with legislators to criminalize bystanders. I make the argument, the perpetrator is the perpetrator, but if he or she, by the way, she also, right? There are she perpetrators. If they know that they, quote unquote, can get away with it, that they're protected, there's this ecosystem, then the critical thing to do is to bust that ecosystem. And I'm a firm believer in accountability, and I'm a firm believer in criminal accountability. And that for me is the driving theme of this whole project.
So many listeners are probably sitting here going, wow, this individual, this perpetrator could have been stopped so many times. And when you really look at some of these cases, and you dive deep into them, that's like you said, they take years to uncover. It's a web. And your book really focuses on that ecosystem of stopping the behavior and holding not only the perpetrator accountable, but all of the all of the enablers that surround them. And when you start really focusing in on one individual, that web extends and extends and extends really rapidly. You and I had talked previously before even recording, and it's something where, parents might be listening to this or family members will listen to this, and it's happening more than we think it is, especially in school systems and in districts, in public and private. It's something where so many people are just shocked that it's happening. So, what do you think, especially considering the extensive complaints that were submitted to faculty and, all the upper admin? Do you think that it could have been stopped sooner? Or do you think that, especially now in society, that maybe we don't take it as serious listening to children's voices? I think that that's something we have to be really clear about. It's listening to the children.
I think you're 100% right. And I say it's listening plus believing. You know better than I do that statistics show that somewhere around 92% of sexual assault complaints are correct. I didn't say they're 100% accurate. They're not. And that's understandable for all the obvious reasons, but they are correct. And the person who's come forward, I'm in that incredibly fortunate position where the last time anybody laid a hand on me was in 8th grade playing floor hockey in Ann Arbor, Michigan. That's literally the last time anybody put their hand on me. Floor hockey, Ann Arbor, 8th grade, like 45 million years ago. When a person who comes forward to a parent or a school teacher or whomever, an administrator, and says this is happening, you're so correct. The instinctual, oh, maybe you misunderstood. He's a really good guy. He's a great teacher. I know his family. I'll regale you with a story. I have to fudge the facts, obviously. Met with me a woman. She's a teacher. She is a teacher who had been assaulted by a male teacher. And when she went to the principal, he kissed her on the forehead. That she was not interested in being kissed. The instinctual response of the principal was, he's a great guy. We go to the same church. And her response was, I don't care about the church. That's the instinctual response, is to minimize it, is to dismiss it. In spite of the fact that, and you're so right, that it repeats itself literally ad nauseum. And for the parents and family members, not only parents, because sometimes family members maybe are a little bit more observant of what's happening with someone else's child, for all the obvious reasons that we all know. The most devastating thing that can happen to a child is not to be believed. That's one. Two, by now having interviewed and met with enough people who thought they were in a relationship in high school with the teacher, other teachers see signs. Right? I met with one person who had what she thought was an affair, which obviously wasn't. In his office, he would close, she's in 11th grade, and he would close his office door. Other teachers would see that he's going into his office with an 11th grader. That just every which way is wrong, every which way, right? the obligation, one, is to believe. Two, it's going to require a societal shift with respect to the enabler. So I sometimes go online to see, I don't care about the compliments about my work. I'm more intrigued in why I get bashed, right? And I find that to be interesting. And somebody wrote about me, I think it was meant to be critical, that what Guiora seeks to do is to change the social contract. I took that as a compliment. I said, that's exactly what I need to do. Because I want us to understand that the perpetrator, with all due respect to that perp, right, what you call the web, the ecosystem, that's what makes it possible. And until we bust that, ain't nothing going to change. And yes, there are civil suits. And yes, so school districts settle. Frankly, it's taxpayer money. I mean, we could talk about Michigan State, Penn State, Ohio State, Catholic Church, USC, University of Michigan, the list is long. Those institutions are paying out what seems to be a lot of money. It's actually per victim. It's not a lot of money. And we just, settle and off we go. That doesn't address anything, because all it meant is that the taxpayer now paid, take Michigan, University of Michigan, I think it's $500 million. The Michigan State was it 480, 490? But that's really not a whole, if you think about it, 500 victims, $450 million is actually not a lot of money. And it didn't cost the institution anything. And there's been talk about insurance companies going to universities and school districts and saying, no more, you're on your own. And what universities are saying in return, oh, no. We would have to take that out of our endowment. And if we take it out of our endowment, we will be penalizing our future students by denying them a great education, blah, blah. So the civil suits are fine. But for me, I leave civil suits to others. For me, the only way that we can really bust this, pardon my English, is for those enablers to be held criminally accountable. So by comparison, in Utah, because I worked with Representative Brian King on criminalizing the bystander. So it's a Class D misdemeanor. It's $1,500 and or 6 months in jail. I don't know about you, but $1,500 is $1,500 and or 6 months in jail is, 6 months in jail. But if we're really serious about this, that's the only way. That Tusk, he didn't really understand. Oh, he's a good guy. He really is a good guy. No, he's not. A teacher who invites little boys to his cabin, and I apologize for the intimacy of the discussion, goes skinny dipping with them, takes showers with them, talks to them about their sex lives. They're 12. That's a person who cannot, under any circumstance, be protected by other adults.
When we hear so often, this person was a great guy or a great female, it is perpetrators, like you said, are men and women, but we're not categorizing. They morph into their environment. I think that's very important. We've seen it so many different times with so many different stories. So many people are stating, well, I thought they were a good person. They morph to that community. They shadow different people. They want to be accepted. They want to be appreciated. And that way it turned heads. We've talked about this so many times in regards to our law enforcement, criminal justice system, learning and being educated, which I really ask a lot of parents that are listening. How are you talking to your children? How are you having those hard conversations that not only you can see the signs on the outside, maybe in your family unit, or even, like you said, with other children, but are children being educated on this is not okay? This type of interaction, physically or emotionally or mentally, this is not okay, to where children are able to speak up with this happening so much. That's also going to help stop that ecosystem from growing and the webs to continue and these perpetrators to feel comfortable with enablers in their society. Because we have to really educate parents and children of speaking up, speaking out. That's the very, very first step. I mean, when you told me the story of Jeremy, my first reaction was, why would you ever let your child go to an adult male's cabin, home, anywhere alone? Because I mean, I was born in 85 and like even now at 38, I'm like, I would never dream of doing that, let alone my parents at that time would be like, but now, especially in 2024, now we're looking at things differently of you're an adult, this is a child, what's going on here? Do you think that that was probably an issue in
I
1997?
think you make a great point. I add to that, they're very careful and thoughtful in who they target. So Jeremy came from divorced. His parents were divorced, so they hone in, and I mean, think about Catholic Church priests, right? They know who are the vulnerable, and they hone in on kids whose home structure or family life, um, perhaps it's not, Ozzie and Harriet 1950s. It's more complicated, and now you're the male figure when there's not a father, even though Jeremy's father was, alive. That weekend, the boy was supposed to be with the father, but he was the mom. Whatever arrangements were made, not made it until you ask. Um, one of the people in a different setting that I spent time with, she was abused from the age of 7 till 14 by the family priest in the house. And when this was shared with her mom, the mom said, "Oh, he just loves her," but he didn't mean he loves her sexually. He just cares for her. So I say these guys, or women too, want to emphasize, are really skillful in identifying the vulnerable. But the fact that they're skillful in identifying the vulnerable, shame on them, obviously. But that in no way justifies the enabler or the enablers who clearly have a vested. This is my take. Again, if Dan were here, you could have a different argument. I'm convinced that the enablers are all about protecting the institution directly, and the perpetrator is the beneficiary of that. And I think, when I wrote my book, Armies of Enablers, and I looked at Michigan State, Ohio State, Penn State, Catholic Church, USA Gymnastics, the enablers, coaches, trainers, the Catholic Church above the priest, or Cardinal Law in Boston, had one interest, and that was to protect the institution. And the survivor, or pardon my English, the survivor be damned. And what enablers do, they're also very good at the dismissiveness. So with Cardinal Law, one of the boys who was abused, when this came to his attention, Cardinal Law, I said, "I thought it was just horseplay." That's just classic enabler language. Just, the priest and the boy, he really, no, this is not horseplay. This is sexual assault. And one of the things, to your point, that absolutely we need to have these painful, honest conversations about those who we trust. Because, I'm the secular Jew in the room, so I don't, this is not part of my life, but I'm sure that for people of faith, they trust the priest, the rabbi, the whomever, right? And then you see how that is systemically and systematically violated. Fine, okay, so those guys need to go to jail. But the communal response to protect that, for me, to say keeps me up, because I am not exaggerating when I tell you that literally daily I wake up to emails from people who heard about me, read about me, whatever. Here today, today's Monday in Israel, I woke up to an email from a woman we'll call Jane, who this happened to her and this happened to her, and she heard about me, read about me, and is grateful that I'm at least beginning the process of addressing the enablers. I mean, it's a fight.
Yes. Well, I appreciate you coming on the podcast talking about Jeremy Bell's story. Like you said, this is something where we're able to use to educate. It's not something to use for entertainment or anything like that. I'm going to put all of your information for your book. I highly, highly recommend listeners, please go pre-order it now. Don't wait till the end of the month, because especially when the podcast airs, I'm not really sure how many people are going to rush to order this book, but start having those hard conversations. Even if you're not a parent, please, of a child or a parent or a family unit surrounding you, have those honest and difficult conversations, because the sooner we start getting comfortable with that word sexual assault, especially when it comes to children and schools and just in our society, we're going to be better at really wrecking that ecosystem, stopping enablers, and creating that division in that web that I think is necessary. And that's exactly what you're doing.
You're beyond gracious. Thank you so very much.